The morning mist clung to the battlefield like a shroud, and in that silence before dawn, young William Hartley pressed his trembling fingers against the cold metal of his rifle. He had dreamed of glory, of returning home a hero with stories that would make the village girls swoon and the old men nod with respect. But as he stared across the valley at the enemy lines, all he could think about was his mother's last words. "Come back to me, my boy. Come back home." What William didn't know was that in less than an hour, he would charge into history's most brutal cavalry assault, and neither he nor his dreams would survive the morning. 3 months earlier, William had been nothing more than a blacksmith's apprentice in the quiet English countryside. His hands, now calloused from gripping weapons, had once-shaped horseshoes and mended plows. The village of Ashford knew him as the boy who helped old Mrs. Henderson carry her groceries, who fixed children's toys for free, and who had never traveled further than the neighboring town. But the year was 1854, and war had come calling. The Crimean Peninsula seemed like a distant dream, a place that existed only in the geography books at the village school. When the recruitment officers arrived with their bright uniforms and grand speeches about duty and honor, William felt something stir in his chest that he had never experienced before, a burning desire to be part of something greater than himself. His father, Thomas Hartley, had been a soldier once, not in any glorious campaign, but in the mundane peacetime army that drilled endlessly and never saw action. Thomas had returned home with stories of boredom and bad food, warning William that war was nothing like the tales in books. But William was 19, and 19-year-old boys don't listen to warnings about dreams. "You don't understand, father," William had said on that fateful evening when he announced his decision. "This is my chance to make something of myself, to be remembered." Thomas had looked at his son with eyes that held too much knowledge and too much pain. "Boy, the only thing worse than being forgotten is being remembered for the wrong reasons." But William signed the papers anyway, swept up in the romance of it all. The uniform fit him well, the rifle felt solid in his hands, and when he marched through the village square with his regiment, he felt like he was walking on air. The cheers of the crowd, the flutter of handkerchiefs, the pride in his mother's eyes. It was everything he had imagined and more. The journey to the Crimea was William's first real adventure. He had never seen the ocean before, and standing on the deck of the transport ship, watching England fade into horizon, he felt like he was shedding his old life like a snake sheds its skin. His fellow soldiers were a mix of seasoned veterans and young men like himself, all united by the common belief that they were embarking on something noble and necessary. During the long voyage, William befriended a soldier named Patrick O'Brien, an Irishman with a quick wit and an endless supply of stories. Patrick had been a soldier for 5 years, but he had never seen real combat either. Together, they would spend hours on deck, imagining what their first battle would be like, how they would conduct themselves with honor, how they would return home as heroes. "The thing about war," Patrick would say, his eyes twinkling with mischief, "is that it separates the men from the boys. And I have a feeling, William, my friend, that we're about to become men." Neither of them could have imagined what kind of men they would become, or how quickly their boyhood would be stripped away. The reality of war revealed itself slowly, like a poison working its way through the bloodstream. The first shock came not from enemy fire, but from the conditions. The camp was a maze of mud and misery, where disease killed more men than bullets ever would. William watched strong men waste away from cholera and dysentery, their dreams of glory replaced by the simple desire to survive another day. The first dead body William saw was not an enemy soldier, but Private Jenkins from his own company, a boy of 17 who had lied about his age to enlist. Jenkins died in the night, quietly, without fanfare, his body discovered in the morning by a sergeant who barely paused to acknowledge the loss before ordering the body to be buried in the growing cemetery outside the camp. William stood at that grave, staring down at the rough wooden cross that marked Jenkins' final resting place, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. This wasn't the noble sacrifice he had imagined. This was just waste. Pure, senseless waste. But the real education began when the fighting started. The first time William heard the whistle of artillery shells overhead, he discovered that his body could move without his conscious decision. He found himself pressed against the ground, his face in the mud, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. The sound was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a shrieking, tearing noise that seemed to rip the very air apart. When the bombardment ended, William looked up to see that the tent next to us had simply vanished. Not destroyed, not damaged, gone, as if it had never existed at all. In its place was a crater filled with smoking debris and things that William's mind refused to identify. Patrick found him there, still staring at the empty space where their friends had been moments before. "William," he said quietly, "we need to move. The orders come down. We're going to probe their lines." That first engagement was a nightmare of confusion and terror. William fired his rifle, but he couldn't tell if he hit anything. The smoke was so thick that he could barely see his own hands, and the noise was so overwhelming that he couldn't hear the orders being shouted all around him. Men appeared and disappeared in the gray haze like ghosts, some wearing the same uniform as him, others wearing different colors that marked them as enemies. When it was over, William realized that he had survived his first battle, but he felt no pride, no sense of accomplishment. He felt hollow, as if something essential had been carved out of him and left on the battlefield. That night, he wrote a letter to his mother, but found himself unable to describe what he had experienced. How could he explain to her that the boy who had left Ashford no longer existed? The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of skirmishes, bombardments, and a constant, gnawing fear that lived in William's stomach like a living thing. He watched good men die for small pieces of ground that would be lost and retaken a dozen times. He saw friends cut down by sniper fire while they were writing letters home. He learned to sleep to the sound of men screaming in the medical tents. Most of all, he learned to hate the word glory. The officers still used it, still talked about honor and duty and the nobility of their cause. But William had seen what glory actually looked like. It looked like Patrick O'Brien clutching his stomach and crying for his mother as his blood seeped into the foreign soil. It looked like the mountain of letters from home that would never be answered, stacked in the company commander's tent-like accusations. The transformation was complete when William realized that he no longer thought about home as a place he would return to, but as a beautiful dream that belonged to someone else. Someone who had died in the mud of the Crimea without anyone bothering to bury him properly. If you're finding yourself drawn into William's story, if you're feeling the way of his journey from innocence to harsh reality, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. These stories of human experience, of how we change and grow through adversity, are what we're passionate about sharing. Your support helps us continue bringing these deep, emotional narratives to life. October 25th, 1854. The morning that will be remembered as the charge of the Light Brigade, though William knew nothing of history, or the famous poem that will be written about this day. All he knew was that the orders had come down from the top. 673 men of the Light Brigade would charge straight into the heart of the Russian artillery. William stood in formation, his horse shifting nervously beneath him. He had become a good rider during his months in Crimea, though he took no pleasure in the skill. The animal sensed the tension in the air, the electric anticipation that preceded every battle. Around him, his fellow troopers sat in their saddles with the quiet dignity of men who knew they were about to die. The valley spread out before them, like a corridor of death. Russian guns lined the heights on both sides, their black mouths pointed down at the narrow strip of ground the Light Brigade would have to cross. At the far end of the valley, more artillery waited, supported by infantry and cavalry. It was a perfect killing ground, and everyone knew it. Captain Morrison rode up and down the line, his face pale but determined. "Men," he called out, his voice carrying across the formation, "we have our orders. We ride for the guns at the end of the valley. We ride for England. We ride for honor." William wanted to laugh, but found he couldn't. Honor. The word had lost all meaning for him months ago. He rode now for something simpler and more terrible, because he had forgotten how to do anything else. The trumpet sounded, and 673 men began to move forward at a walk. William felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the cold sweat that always came before action. But this time, there was something else, a strange calm that he had never experienced before. Perhaps this was what they called courage, or perhaps it was just a final surrender of hope. The pace increased to a trot, then a canter, then a full gallop. The valley walls seemed to close in around them as they rode, and William could see the Russian gunners frantically loading their artillery pieces. He knew what was coming. They all did. In a few seconds, the valley would become hell on earth. The first volley arrived like thunder. William saw the horse next to him simply collapse, its rider thrown 20 feet through the air. The sound was indescribable. Not just explosions of shells, but the screaming of wounded horses, the cries of men, the splintering of wood, and the ringing of metal against metal. William's horse stumbled but kept running. Around him, the formation was dissolving into chaos. Men and animals fell in tangles of blood and dust. The smoke was so thick that he couldn't see more than a few yards in any direction. But still they rode, driven by momentum and training, and something that might have been bravery or might have been madness. A shell exploded directly in front of William, and he felt the heat wash over him like opening the door to a furnace. His horse screamed and reared, and for a moment he was airborne, flying through the smoke and fire with a strange sense of weightlessness. He hit the ground hard, his rifle spinning away from him, his vision filled with stars and darkness. When he struggled to his feet, he found himself alone in the valley of death. The charge had swept past him, leaving behind only the debris of destroyed dreams. Wounded horses thrashed in the mud, their eyes wild with pain and terror. Men who had been his friends and comrades lay scattered across the ground like broken dolls. William picked up his rifle and began to walk forward. He didn't know why. The charge had failed, the survivors were retreating, and he should have been running for his life. But something drew him on, some terrible magnetism that pulled him toward the Russian lines. He thought of his mother, of his father's warnings, of the village that seemed like it belonged to another world. He thought of Patrick O'Brien, whose body lay somewhere behind him in the carnage. He thought of Private Jenkins, who had died quietly in his sleep and was probably the luckiest of them all. Most of all, he thought of the boy who had enlisted 3 months ago, full of dreams and grand ambitions. That boy had been so naive, so eager to prove himself. William felt a strange affection for that lost child, mixed with a terrible pity. The boy had wanted to be a hero, and in a way, he had gotten his wish. It just hadn't looked anything like he had imagined. As we reach the most intense moment of William's journey, I want to pause and ask you to join our community. If this story is resonating with you, if you're feeling the weight of William's transformation, please subscribe and like this video. These stories matter. They help us understand the human cost of the choices we make and the dreams we chase. William never reached the Russian lines. A piece of shrapnel from a bursting shell caught him in the chest, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. He lay there in the mud, watching the sky wheel overhead, and felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. The pain was distant, almost abstract. What struck him most was the silence. After hours of artillery fire and screaming, the valley had become almost quiet. He could hear the wind rustling through the grass, the distant sound of voices calling for wounded, the soft nickering of a horse that had somehow survived the carnage. A Russian soldier found him there, a young man about his own age with kind eyes and gentle hands. The soldier gave him water and tried to stop the bleeding, speaking in a language William didn't understand, but in a tone that needed no translation. It was the voice of one human being trying to comfort another nationality and uniform forgotten in the face of simple human suffering. William wanted to thank him, but found that he couldn't speak. Instead, he looked up at the soldier and tried to smile. The Russian understood and squeezed his hand gently before moving on to help others. As the afternoon wore on, William drifted in and out of consciousness. In his lucid moments, he found himself thinking not of the charge or the battle, but of smaller things. The smell of his mother's bread baking, the sound of his father's hammer on the anvil, the way the light fell through the windows of the village church on Sunday mornings. He realized that somewhere in the chaos of the last few months, he had lost sight of what was truly important. The glory he had sought was a phantom, a cruel joke played on young men who didn't know any better. The real treasures have been the quiet moments, the simple connections, the everyday kindnesses that made life worth living. A British stretcher team found him as the sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson. They were gentle with him, these tired men who had spent the day collecting the wounded and the dead. William could see in their faces the same transformation he had undergone, the death of innocence, the birth of harder, sadder wisdom. They carried him to the field hospital, where overworked doctors and nurses did what they could for the endless stream of casualties. William lay on a cot, listening to the sound of suffering around him, and felt a strange gratitude for the simple fact that he was still alive. William Hartley died 3 days later, not from his wounds, but from infection. The invisible killer that claimed more soldiers than enemy fire ever would. His last letter, dictated to a nurse because he could no longer hold a pen, was brief and simple. "Dear Mother, I want you to know that I understand now what Father tried to tell me. War is not what the poets say it is. It is not noble or glorious. It is simply waste. The waste of young lives, young dreams, young love. I am sorry I did not listen. I am sorry I chose to learn this lesson the hard way. Please tell Father he was right. Please tell him I love him. Please remember me not as a soldier, but as your son, your loving William." The letter reached Ashford 6 weeks later, along with his personal effects and a medal that the government thought would somehow compensate for their loss. His mother kept the letter, but threw the medal away. She understood what her son had learned in his final days, that true honor had nothing to do with charges and battles, and everything to do with love, compassion, and the simple courage of living a good life. William's grave in the Crimea is marked with a simple wooden cross, weathered now by decades of sun and rain. Visitors sometimes stop to read the inscription. "William Hartley, age 19, beloved son." There is no mention of glory, no reference to heroic charges or noble causes. Just a recognition of the fundamental truth that he had discovered too late, that every soldier who dies in war is, first and foremost, someone's child. The boy who had dreamed of being remembered as a hero got his wish, but not in the way he had imagined. He is remembered not for his courage in battle, but for his final understanding of what truly matters. His story serves as a reminder that the greatest adventures are often the ones we have at home, with the people we love, in the quiet moments that seem ordinary but are, in fact, the most precious things we possess. The trooper's charge was over, but the truth he discovered in his final days lives on, that real heroism is not about rushing toward death, but about embracing life in all its simple, complicated, beautiful forms. Thank you for joining us on William's journey from innocence to understanding. These stories of human transformation, of how we learn and grow through both triumph and tragedy, are what drive us to create this content. If this story moved you, please let us know in the comment below. Tell us what city you're watching from, and share what musician or band you'd like to see us create a story around next. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these deep, emotional narratives to life. And of course, if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Until next time, remember that every story matters, and every human experience has something to teach us about what it means to be alive.